And then the threats really escalated until one day when I was contacted by a tabloid reporter who told me that she had the photos and that they were going to publish a story about me because he provided the photos. And it was on the front page of the New York Post. And I was removed from my job immediately. It was humiliating and terrifying, and everything I had built up for a 15-year career was gone.
Annie Seifullah was a beloved high school principal in New York City when she started dating a charming man who was, unbeknownst to her, a serial abuser whose ex-fiance lived in a domestic violence shelter. In this interview, Annie describes how this man was able to ruin her life and how her young son inspired her to fight back and build a new life. So what was your life like before the incident?
I call it the event. So I can describe what it was in my life. But before the event, I was a very well-regarded high school principal in New York City. I ran a middle and high school public school, and I was extremely high-performing. In the 3 years that I'd been principal, I had increased the graduation rate by 20%. It really made a big difference. I was known for being a strong leader. I lived in the community where my school was, so the school was very much part of my life. And so before the incident happened, my life was really good professionally. I was struggling in my personal life because I was just recently separated from my husband and I had a young son. So I was a new single mom, and one part of my life was really incredible. And in one part of my life, I felt very sad and vulnerable and maybe a little ashamed. It wasn't what I thought life was going to be. I'm describing my life before I met the abuser, because it wasn't my ex-husband who did this. It was the man who I dated subsequent to him.
How did you meet the man who did this to you?
He was the father of one of my students. And he was really charming and handsome, and he was a single dad, and we really hit it off. And I thought he was a really amazing person. And so he expressed an interest in dating me, and I was interested in him too. I thought he was really attractive and compelling. He owned his own company, and he seemed very involved in his son's life. And I was newly a single mom. And so I felt like, oh, he and I really have something in common. So I talked to my supervisor and I asked if it was against the rules for me to date, one of the parents of one of my students. They said, no, there's no rules against it. You just have to make sure that you don't give the student or the parent any sort of unfair treatment. Said yeah, people date people they meet through the school community all the time. And so that was how I came to know him. And also because of the context of our relationship, it was why he was able to cause so much damage.
How did your relationship with him go downward, and how did that correlate with the event?
So things became serious really fast. And then once we were sort of decided that we were going to be serious about our relationship, he started being extremely threatening. And he was lying a lot and threatening that if I didn't do certain things that he was going to destroy my life. And so it's a really common narrative actually that I've come to know. At the time, I had never been in an abusive relationship before, so I didn't recognize the signs. But now that I do this as a profession, I see all of the sort of red flags that came up. He was from the very beginning very into me and wanted to talk about all of our secrets and wanted to live our lives together. Once we decided we were going to date, it was this very fast and furious romance. And then what he started to do was he started to use these things that I had confided in him. He started just twisting them and using them to pressure me into providing for him financially, for example, because one of the things I discovered after we'd started dating was that his company, which he told me it was his company, it turned out later it was not his company. He was running someone else's business, but he was portraying himself as it was his company, that he had bankrupted. And so I think that he was just looking for an out. And I don't want to get ahead of myself because later I found out that he had done this before to other people. So I was just, his next mark was I was just a successful woman with a good salary and a stable life that he could attach himself to. And he was trying to keep me scared so that I would continue to provide for him.
That's horrible. Were there any other red flags that you saw that also now stand out to you that way?
Yeah, and especially because I've become an advocate in this space. I hear stories like mine a lot. Now, looking back, for sure, one of the common red flags is he never introduced me to anyone in his family. He was always talking about his friends from his childhood and his friends who lived this place or that place, but he never introduced me to his friends. In fact, the whole time we were dated for almost a year and a half, and I think during that entire time I met 2 of his friends. Also, the other big red flag was that he was just a perpetual victim. All the women who he'd ever dated had been lying, abusive, manipulative people, and that, he was so happy to finally be with someone who wasn't like that. It's a big red flag too. If you meet with someone who has never done anything wrong, has always been the victim, and who every relationship they've ever had prior to you, business and romantic, has gone bad. So red flag.
How did the event begin? How did the relationship end?
Well, a lot of it I had to put together in retrospect because he was premeditating a lot of what happened. So I found out that he lied to me and said basically that he had discovered there were a bunch of intimate images of me, sexual images of me, that somebody had like provided them to him, or they were somewhere online, but he wouldn't tell me where they were. And they were photographs that they were old. I hadn't taken with him. They were like old pictures I had taken with my ex-husband. And he claimed that people had come forward and given them to him and that they were going to expose me publicly, but he was going to help me. He was going to help me, make sure these things didn't happen. And so it started with these weird, convoluted stories, but I was really freaked out. I was a high school principal. I didn't know who possibly would have given him these pictures. I knew my ex-husband wouldn't because he and I were on good terms. He was a nice guy, even though our marriage didn't work out. And I was just confused as to like where they were coming from and who these people, these anonymous people out there were who were like trying to expose my nude photos. I didn't make sense of it. I was so embarrassed and ashamed, and I felt like it was my fault. And so I didn't ask for help. I just kind of like kept it quiet and just lived in shame while he continued to perpetuate these lies. And whenever I would ask him information, he would deflect and he didn't know and he wasn't sure. And there's so many things now, this is what I do for my job. I like help people who come to me who are in this situation and I can help them solve it. But at the time I just had no idea. I had no idea what was happening because this was 2014. Revenge porn was something that I didn't even know what that was. I had never even heard the term. It was way before people were really talking about it, before it was made illegal. But eventually I saw that he was just lying and just manipulating me. I thought he was just maybe desperate for money. And so I broke up with him and I left. I left the relationship, and I basically in the middle of the day, one day I took my son and packed as much stuff as I could carry with me. And I just fled the house and went to go live someplace else. And then the threats really escalated, and they escalated until one day when I was contacted by a tabloid reporter who told me that she had the photos and that they were going to publish a story about me because he provided the photos. It wasn't some random online anonymous offender out in the world. He provided the photos to both my superintendent and to the New York City tabloids, and also made allegations and insinuated that the photos were taken on school property. Like I was using my school as a place where I was like having sex with people, which of course was not true at all. But there was a photo of me in, not an explicit photo, but a photo that was from the collection of photos that he had distributed. And it was a photo of me in like fishnet tights and a bra in my bedroom. Like my bed is behind me and there's a baby crib in the background. Like it's very clearly my bedroom and not school property, or it has nothing to do with my life as a principal. And it was on the front page of the New York Post. And I was removed from my job immediately, pending an investigation into the allegations he had made against me. It was really awful because I really just didn't think he had it in him. I had sort of just like convinced myself that he had no power over me, that he was just like a dumb liar, and that he just wouldn't do that because it just seems like so cruel. Like he knew I was a very good principal, and he knew that the story he was manufacturing in these photos that he was handing over had nothing to do with anything about my life as a principal. And he still did it because he wanted to. I actually don't know why he did it. I was removed from my job, and it was really awful. It was humiliating and terrifying, and everything I had built up for a 15-year career was gone, and the Department of Education was clearly ready to throw me under the bus, even though I had an impeccable career. I never in my entire time as a teacher or principal ever had a complaint made against me. I had only ever been a very high performer, and there was nothing in my record that ever would have supported that this was something that was in my character. And they knew it, like people who knew me knew this was just a big lie, but they just had this problem, which is that intimate photos of me had been made public, and I was a female school leader, and they didn't know what to do about it. And nobody was talking about non-consensual pornography at that time. It was just, I was kind of patient zero for New York City on this matter. And then what happened is once I got that publicity, I started getting contacted by people. And I'm very protective of those folks, so I don't always say too much information about them, but I was contacted by several people who had been in romantic relationship with him prior, and said that he had also made similar threats. I had been contacted by people who he had done business with, like people he went to school with or like who knew him, and they all reported to me that he was a fraudster. And when I started realizing all these things were happening and I ran a background report on him, I found that he'd been sued for fraud, and he was being sued by the people whose business he was running. He had an order of protection against him, and his ex, who was the mother of his 2 children, turned out she was living in a domestic violence shelter. And I had been dating him for a year and a half, and I had never known any of these details about him.
I don't think I'm ever going to date anyone again without doing a background check.
It's so funny you say that because I feel the exact same way. But who does a background? Like, that's not normal. It's not normal to live in a world where you have to do a background check, but it's a different world now. And so I live differently and tell my friends different things. Like now when my friends are dating someone, I'm like, can you just send me his date of birth and his phone number so I can just do a quick check on him?
Okay, so can you kind of go through the events as they occurred?
So what happened after I was removed was that the Department of Education started an investigation into the allegations. And they were at the same time really pressuring me to resign. And I went to my union lawyer and asked him what I should do. He was a well-intentioned, lovely older gentleman who said I was in a lot of trouble and I should probably just change my name and move to Los Angeles. And he said, the New York City Department of Ed and the New York City media is against you right now. You can't win. You can't beat them. And I said, but I didn't do anything wrong. I these allegations are insane. And I've been the victim of this person. I thought at the time it was extortion. I thought he just wanted money from me. And when I stopped paying, he came through on his threat. And they were just like, sorry that happened to you, but your photos are out there. We can't save you. So I called a really close friend who is actually the mom of one of my students. And she's incredible. She remains a very close friend to this day. And she was like, you have to get a lawyer. You have to fight this. And I was, I don't know what to do. And she said, just think of your son. My son was 2.5 years old and I was a single mom and I was all he had. And she was like, you can't not fight this. What are you gonna do? Good. Change your name. Your son can't change his name. This is going to follow you forever. And you have to fight. You don't have any other choice. And you have to call me tomorrow and you have to tell me that you hired a lawyer. So I hired a lawyer that was really helpful to me in the beginning and was able to get me through the initial parts of just speaking to the media and giving a defense. And then I had to wait a long time, but the investigation report came out and it concluded that none of the allegations, not one, he made many allegations against me and none of them were substantiated. The only thing they substantiated was that one time I had done some personal business on a sick day, which is just ludicrous. I mean, it's just so trying to find something to catch me on. And then they were charging me with misconduct for all of the photos that he had put on this device and then given it to my superintendent, claiming that this device was my work device. And so that was all they could really charge me with, was that the photos he provided and then some other just dumb little ticky-tacky things. The Department of Ed was still really trying to push me to resign and I wouldn't. And so once the investigation report came out and I was able to get a little bit of positive media, people at least telling my story, I had a big article in the Daily Mail that used the investigation report as a way to tell my story of how none of these claims that this man had made against me were substantiated. And he was claiming that I was having sex with a student and a parent and an assistant principal. And, he was just made all these really wild allegations. But it's very likely that if those things had happened, that someone would have said something, someone would have been a witness to it. And all that happened was that I just had a lot of support from the people who knew me that just said none of this is in line with Annie's character. And so I started getting a little bit of positive press, but there was no determination and I was still working for the DOE. So the tabloids were writing about how I was a cougar in the Cubs den. The tabloids loved the fact that the underwear principal was still working because they assigned me to teach temporarily in a school while I was waiting for my termination hearing, basically. So eventually they took me to a termination hearing, and during the termination hearing, even though the forensic investigator and the DOE investigator testified that all of the files, all of those nude photos depicting me had been transferred to the laptop that was handed over to my superintendent from an Android that was literally had the name of my abusive ex-boyfriend's name on it. It was in the metadata. It was showed that it went from his phone to the computer and that none of those photos had anything to do with anything with school. I mean, it was just they laid it all out. And one of the witnesses they called from the Department of Ed, a man that I had dated, they called to be a character witness against me. And he actually on the stand surprised them with his testimony and was like, no, Annie has impeccable character. And she was a victim of a terrible thing. And he was a really good, helpful witness to me. So at the end of it, they couldn't terminate me, but the arbitrator who was overseeing the termination hearing suspended me and gave me a sort of a slap on the wrist. But during that termination hearing, they kept threatening me that if I didn't resign, they were going to take me to this termination hearing and they were going to show the photos, which would make them part of the public spectacle of the termination hearing. They were nude photos of me in sexual acts with my ex-husband. They were for way long ago. They had nothing to do with any of this, but they kept threatening they were going to use the photos. And they were using that as leverage to get me to resign. And I wouldn't resign. And so I sat there in the termination hearing while one by one, they showed the photos blown up, 4 copies. Everybody had one and they just showed them one by one. I mean, the Department of Ed essentially just became an extension of my abuser. They were just trying to shame me into going away. And I didn't. And it was awful. It was so traumatic. It was the most terrible experience. I can't even possibly describe it, but I also wasn't going to resign. I just out of principle, I wasn't going to. So after they suspended me, I hired Carrie Goldberg, who I now work for, but that's down the road. After they suspended me, I hired Carrie Goldberg, who is the famous revenge porn attorney. We don't like to use the word revenge porn. We use the word non-consensual pornography, or NCP for short, but revenge porn is what people commonly refer to it as. So I hired her, and she in federal court sued the Department of Ed for gender discrimination. And we made the case that there were all sorts of male principals who had had sexual allegations made against them, like sexual harassment, that there had been many male principals, even some in my district, who had had really serious allegations made against them, and they were allowed to keep their job while it was being investigated. And I was summarily thrown out and never allowed back in, and never allowed a chance to get my job back. They like just pushed me down to teacher, and they demoted me, and never even considered that I might like to be deserving of my job back. It was just, I don't think it was ever a consideration. And so we filed a really explosive lawsuit in federal court. And once sort of like the facts went public, and I wrote an article for Jezebel that went viral. That was just the first time ever I had just told a story from my words of what happened from beginning to end. And then the Department of Ed settled with me. In exchange for my resignation, they provided me with money. And during that period of time where I was fighting the lawsuit, I put myself through law school. And around the same time we settled the lawsuit, I was graduating from law school, and I took the bar, and I passed, and Carrie hired me to work at her law firm. So now I get to represent people who have been through what I've been through and worse. I mean, like the whole gamut of online or cyber exploitation, harassment, stalking, revenge porn, or NCP as we prefer to call it. And I get to be on this side of the fight now, which is pretty awesome.
Wow, that's amazing. So what helped you the most to get through it, and who helped you the most? I know you mentioned a couple of your friends.
Yeah. So unfortunately, a lot of my friends in the Department of Ed, even ones who were well-intentioned and wanted to be supportive, couldn't, because if they spoke out in public to support me, it could put their job in jeopardy. But one of the great things about going through a really awful, humiliating sex scandal, and it's so local too, it was just like a New York City tabloid, and I was a New York City principal, and like everybody knew, and I lived in the neighborhood where my school was. It was so humiliating and difficult, and I felt like it was my fault. You know, I've worked past that part, but at the time I was just like, this is all my fault. I should have seen it was coming. I shouldn't have had those photos. I shouldn't have. But one of the great things about going through something that terrible is you find out who your real friends are. And so there was people who I thought would have stuck by me through something like this, and who totally disappeared because they just didn't want to be near it because of the scandal or because of their politics or appearances. I don't really know. But there was some people who just showed up and just held me and carried me and were my friends and like fought for me and spoke for me publicly. And this one mom I was telling you about, who's the one who called, that's my friend Gianna. I mean, she's still one of my best friends. I just took that as a real turning point for me too. Like in my life, I was like 36 years old, and I was a single mom, and I was needing to assess my life, you know, like what's real friendship? How much is it worth it to fight for a job? And there was a handful of female friends, mostly moms, who were just like my rocks through that whole thing. And then when I started law school, the greatest thing about law school was that I was like literally like in the tabloids while I was going through law school. Like my story was being covered. I would go to school one night, my friends would be like, oh, I saw the article about your case today. And it was so weird. But, you know, I'd go to the Department of Ed. I mean, they would just slut shame me so hard. It's not even slut shaming, just shame me. Like I just felt like a harlot every time I walked into a Department of Ed proceeding. But my law school, I was a hero. And they just loved that I was fighting. Everybody there saw right through it and saw the injustice of it. And so law school was such an incredible turn in terms of me seeing what happened and seeing how I was a victim of a really terrible oppressive system and a terrible abusive boyfriend, and that I needed to fight. And it was really helped to embolden me because I was learning about my legal rights, and I was learning about how to file a federal gender discrimination lawsuit while I was going through it. And it was an incredible way to get a legal education, honestly. I have people say this to me pretty often. Like when they read my story, they'll say, I cannot believe what you went through. It's just everybody's worst nightmare. I don't know how you got through it and how you're so positive. But honestly, what got me through it was my son. My son is the center of my life, and there's nothing more powerful than a mother's love. And I just wanted my son to grow up and be like, if he Googled me or Googled himself, that this shitty, untrue tabloid story with me in unflattering underwear, I didn't want that to be the thing that was like the legacy I left for my son. And so I was like, I want the legacy to be that I fought a bully and won. And I did that. So I feel really proud of that. And honestly, darkest days, my son is the one who got me through all of it.
I feel like people who are in your position often probably feel that there's no light, you know, that there's nothing they can do and their life is over.
Yeah.
So the fact that you were able to come out of it and prove that your life doesn't have to be over, I think that's so incredible.
Thanks. Thanks. I mean, it's also incredible now because I get to be, an attorney, and I get to work with clients who are going through different and similar things. And it's so nice to be able to say to them, truthfully, it gets better. I remember like sitting there after the event happened, sitting around with my friends and like trying to keep my mind off things. And I would look around and everybody would be laughing, having a good time. And occasionally I would have this moment where I was like, nobody's been through this. Like they're all such good friends. They all love me. They're also compassionate, but nobody understands the burden of being a public sex scandal. I just thought like nobody got it. And it's so incredible through my work now that I can be like, I get it. Like I meet people and I'm like, I see you. Like I do, like I was there, like stick with me. It's going to get better. We're going to fight this, and you don't have to run and you don't have to hide. And also it was 4 years I was fighting the Department of Ed. I mean, it felt like 40 years, but in that period of time, in that period of 4 years was when the whole conversation changed around revenge porn and NCP. It was 2017 or 2018 was when revenge porn became illegal in New York City. So had that law been in place in 2014, I would have had a lot more options as a victim. But part of the reason why we were able to make movement on the bill in New York City was because of what happened to me. And the city councilman who co-sponsored that bill remains a very good friend of mine to this day. And so it just made everything feel so much more purposeful that I was able to turn what happened to me into advocacy around an issue that people were talking completely. I mean, there's still so much victim blaming around image abuse, but back then it was just, I would talk to really good people who were like progressive and well-intentioned and feminine and consider themselves feminists, and would be like, but should you have ever taken those photos? That seems like a bad idea. I had images stolen from me and used as a tool of exploitation and abuse. Like that's what happened. I was a victim of a crime. But at the time, it was just like, well, you shouldn't have nice photos of yourself in underwear, I guess.
I meant to clarify this earlier, but how did the abuser get the photos?
Yeah, I'm still not totally sure how he got all of them. Some of them I'm pretty sure I can trace back to devices, like old devices that were in my house that he probably went through when I wasn't around. For sure, my ex-husband didn't get them to him. It's not in his character. Just like it isn't in most people's. Like most people you date wouldn't do that. It's only like a course of control behavior or someone who's like a malignant narcissist or sociopath. These are the types of behaviors that we usually align and attribute to someone who would do such a terrible, damaging, cruel thing to a person. It's just like so cruel. Can you imagine just ever in your life being so mad at someone and thinking someone had to suffer so much that you gave naked photos of them to the media, and knowing that this person was a single mom who was like the only provider for their son? It's like unfathomable to me. I still sometimes just gasp at it. And it happens, of course, because of my line of work, it happens commonly. Carrie Goldberg, my boss, she's amazing. You should read her book. It's called Nobody's Victim. That's another actually really exciting part of the story. I work for Carrie Goldberg, and Carrie Goldberg is the attorney. She was like the mother of revenge porn law. Like she was a victim of non-consensual pornography. And a lot of these stories have like really similar patterns. She was newly divorced. She was feeling pretty vulnerable. She was online dating for the first time. And she met a psychopath who she didn't know was a psychopath. I think he either did or threatened to send nude photos of her to her coworkers. And she worked for a nonprofit legal services organization. She was a lawyer. And she went to lawyers. She went to the family court. She went everywhere. And everybody was like, there's no legal protection for you. So she became the lawyer that she needed. And she created a whole practice. And now she's leading a lot of the advocacy efforts around this. There's a very good, strong group of women, female lawyers, academics, and practitioners who own this space, and Carrie's part of that.
Oh my God, that's amazing. Do you ever have men as your clients?
Yeah, we actually do. We have clients who identify as female and male. And most offenders are male. We do have some female offenders.
You talked a lot about your healing process, but was there anything in particular, any practices that you did every day to heal?
One of the things that really helped me is generally I'm a pretty optimistic person, but that's not to say I didn't experience extremely dark days. I was diagnosed with PTSD. I was diagnosed with anxiety and depression. Those were things that I had not experienced before this. Part of it was that I just stayed busy. I tried to be productive. I tried to get involved in advocacy. When I was in law school, all of my internships were in anti-violence work so that I could work with survivors of intimate partner violence. And that helped me feel normal. The best therapy is fighting for other people. I feel like so many of my clients say the same thing, which is sometimes they feel so empowered and so hopeful, and they are so glad to be fighting this, and they want to be part of a movement, and then they just call me and they can't get out of bed and they just cry, and days are really difficult and dark. And so I experienced all of that, like the ups and the downs and the highs and the lows. I did go to therapy. I made some really important discoveries about myself in terms of my pattern of being a people pleaser and being a person who had allowed myself to be taken advantage of. And it allowed me to be like, oh, I can prevent this type of thing from happening again if I equip myself with the tools to understand it and to stop it. And that was really, really helpful too. I'm a huge fan of meditation. I also trained for a half marathon. Just keeping my body moving was helpful. Those types of things.
So what's something that you would want to tell a victim of non-consensual pornography and abuse?
So many things. As dark as it sounds, I do try to take power away from the event by having a sense of humor about it. If somebody's making a joke about how they had a bad day, I'll be like, have you Googled me? Like this type of thing. If it feels like a big, dark, shameful cloud, then it just maintains power over you. Then the other thing to do is just detach for yourself from what other people might think about you. When you have your intimate photos or intimate images leaked, the thing that you're always so worried about is just walking through my neighborhood and being like, oh my gosh, is that person seeing me naked? Or just what are people thinking about me? I always thought I was such a strong, independent person who didn't care what other people thought of me, but I realized that the opposite was true about me. I was very, very attached to people's approval of me. And best part of what happened to me is that I was able to completely detach myself. Those are two things that really help. I'm to the point now in my story because I love my life so much. I have such a good life. I'm remarried. I have an incredible husband. My son is amazing, strong, happy 10-year-old boy. I love my job. I love going to my job every day. I have the most amazing boss. I'm kind of to the point now where I'm almost grateful that the event happened. And that's a crazy place to be. I never in a million years would have thought that I would ever get to that place. But I oftentimes think about if I could go back to myself in 2014 and just say just tell someone what's happening. I kept saying, oh, he's just a liar. Oh, he's just a mean guy. He'll go away. I was really not coming to terms with the fact that I was in an abusive relationship because it was so out of sync with my identity, right? I was a strong female leader that was successful. And I just was no, I'm not in an abusive relationship. And that silence is the tool that my abuser used against me. And so I just would encourage anyone who is in any type of situation where they feel like they're being exploited or abused or in intimate partner violence to just talk to someone. They say light is the best disinfectant. You just open the box and let the light in and it gets better. It just does.
That was the inspiring and successful lawyer Annie Seifullah. If you think you might be a victim of revenge porn or any type of partner abuse, please look at the description below for resources so you can get help. For more interviews with interesting people, please like this video and subscribe to my channel.